The Scheldt is a 355-kilometer-long river flowing out of northern France through western Belgium and the southwestern Netherlands into the North Sea. In late 1944, as Allied armies liberated France and fought their way north, supply lines were stretched thin. The tools of war — fuel, ammunition, rations, spare parts, new units, replacement vehicles, and personnel — all had to travel from Normandy to a front that was becoming further from the beaches by the day. The need for resupply was critical, and the Belgian port at Antwerp, with its 26 square kilometers of docks, 32 kilometers of waterfront, and 600 cranes, offered the solutions the Allies badly needed. Rotterdam's docks had been destroyed in 1940. Antwerp's were now Europe's most extensive. The port's deep waters and proximity to Germany made it the ideal resupply point and obvious choice to support an invasion of the Reich. But to get supplies into Antwerp, Allied ships had to navigate the Scheldt and the 80-kilometer estuary into it that was controlled by the enemy. 1st Canadian Army, under the acting command of Lieutenant General Guy Simonds, was given the job of driving the Germans out of the Scheldt region. And they would do so, with some help from the Polish and British units, in cold, wet, bloody fighting between October 2nd and November 8th, 1944. It had already been a long, hard slog just getting here. The Canadians under Simonds' predecessor, Lieutenant General Harry Creer, had covered the Allies' left flank during the 3-month advance from the D-Day beaches. They had the added task, too, of capturing the channel ports of Le Havre, Dieppe, Boulogne, Calais, and Dunkirk. Adolf Hitler knew well the importance of seizing these ports intact and demanded they be defended at all costs. These battles tied up resources on both sides. Upon their withdrawal from Antwerp, however, the retreating Germans failed to destroy its coveted port facilities. On September 4th, the British 11th Armored Division followed Belgian resistance forces in, seizing the near fully functional docks in 2 sets of massive locks. However functional, though, a port is useless if there's no way into it. And while the British were standing firm at Antwerp, the Germans were reinforcing units downriver on the South Beveland Peninsula and at Walcheren Island further west. They controlled the 80-kilometer-long estuary on which access to the port depended. The north shore was in enemy hands. Half the length of the south shore was occupied. Wresting the area from the Germans would be a hellish affair, largely fought by an understrength, under-supported army over flooded plains, open ground, and formidable obstacles, namely canals, floodplains, and a narrow causeway. The Scheldt would become one of the most bitterly fought campaigns of the war in Northwest Europe. But Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's attentions were elsewhere. The commander of the 21st Army Group was responsible for planning and managing the Scheldt campaign, but he was focused on Operation Market Garden, an attempt to end the war early by launching a massive airborne and ground assault in German-occupied Holland, capturing key bridges and forging onto Germany's industrial Ruhr heartland. The gambit would fail. As early as September 4th, British Admiral Bertram Ramsay had advised the Admiralty, a distracted Montgomery, and the Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, Dwight D. Eisenhower, of Antwerp's importance. Monty and Ike were at loggerheads for much of the campaign in Europe, and at no time more so than during the Scheldt campaign. It was not until October 13th when Eisenhower gave Montgomery a direct order that the British commander finally considered giving 1st Canadian Army the resources to do the job. While the Allied leadership vacillated, 90,000 men of the German 15th Army escaped the lower Scheldt and shored up their defenses further north. To further complicate matters, 1st Canadian Army's Commander Creer had taken ill and had been shipped off to England. Simmons, who had been commanding 2 Canadian Corps, took his place. Opening the Scheldt estuary involved 4 main operations: clearing the area north of Antwerp and securing access to the South Beveland Peninsula, clearing the Breskens Pocket north of the Leopold Canal and south of the Western Scheldt, capturing the South Beveland Peninsula north of the Scheldt and east of the Walcheren Peninsula, and finally, capturing Walcheren Island. The first attacks by the 4th Canadian Armored Division at the Leopold Canal were repulsed on September 13th. Simmons ordered a halt to operations in the Scheldt until the French Channel ports were taken and more resources were delivered. Subsequent gains were slow to come and were achieved at high costs. The Germans were well armed and ensconced in strongly fortified positions in a landscape that favored their defense. To make matters worse, Montgomery took a Canadian brigade and 3 Allied divisions from the 1st Canadian Army and sent them to fight at Arnhem. This left Simmons with just 3 divisions to face the entire German 15th Army. Yet Simmons never registered a complaint about his lack of manpower, ammunition, and air support. At Eisenhower's headquarters, the British Admiral Ramsay complained to the Supreme Commander that the Canadians were having to ration ammunition, as Montgomery prioritized the Arnhem salient. In South Beveland and Walcheren, the Canadians attacked over open, flooded ground. On October 13th, Black Friday, the Canadian 5th Infantry Brigade's Black Watch was virtually wiped out in a foiled attack. 145 casualties, 56 of them fatal. 3 days later, the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry, the Rileys, suffered similar losses in achieving the Canadians' first objective, taking Vendrecht. This cut the land link to South Beveland and Walcheren. The battle had lasted 10 days. In the Breskens Pocket, heavy rain, flooding, and canals slowed progress and subjected the Canadians to enemy fire so heavy that the advancing units could not link up. The Germans even used coastal guns several kilometers away to fire on Canadian positions, and the cost was steep. 111 fatal, with another 150 suffering from battle exhaustion. During the night of October 13th, engineers of the 16th Field Company were at last able to cross the canals at Strooibroek, Belgium. The next day, Sherman tanks of the 4th Armored Brigade's British Columbia Regiment traversed the new crossings to support the Canadian advance. 1 of every 2 men who crossed the Leopold became a casualty. But a tenuous bridgehead had been achieved. Instead of the 4 days that planners had optimistically expected the operation to take, it was 4 long weeks before the Breskens Pocket was cleared. A stubborn German defense in waterlogged terrain cost the Canadians 2,077 casualties. By October 31st, all land surrounding the Scheldt estuary had been cleared of German control, except for the Walcheren Island, where coastal batteries commanded the approaches to the waterway and access to the ports at Antwerp. Allied aerial bombing had killed many civilians and breached Walcheren dikes. The central part of the island was flooded, and and the German defenders had taken to high ground on the perimeters and in the towns. It took Canadian units 3 attempts just to cross the narrow 1,500-meter-long causeway onto the island from South Beveland. British commandos sealed the deal with a seaward attack from the west. The Calgary Highlanders suffered 64 casualties in 3 days of fighting at the Walcheren Causeway. Le Régiment de Maisonneuve had 1 fatality, and 10 were wounded. After Black Friday, the Black Watch took 85 more casualties by November 1st, the bulk of them on the causeway. After 5 weeks of difficult fighting, the 1st Canadian Army cleared the Scheldt and secured access to the port at Antwerp. The Scheldt campaign cost the Allies 20,873 casualties. Their sacrifice has not been forgotten. Dutch schoolchildren tend their graves. Returning veterans and their descendants are welcomed with open arms. Canada offered a home to the Dutch royal family during their wartime exile. Princess Margriet was born at Ottawa's Civic Hospital on January 19, 1943. As a gesture of gratitude, the Netherlands has sent Canada thousands of tulip bulbs each year since the country was liberated. They are showcased alongside 1 million others during Ottawa's annual Tulip Festival, symbolic of the 2 countries' enduring legacy of gratitude and friendship.
Today is one of Thanksgiving the world over. In Holland, there is real cause to cheer. The capitulation of Germany has literally saved thousands from death by starvation. Their Canadian liberators are feted, and ceremonies of thanks are held for deliverance.